Part Two of Thomas Carlyle by Gilbert Keith Chesterton and John Ernest Hodder Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part Two. When a literary man is known to have been almost a monster of industry, when he has produced a colossal epic like Frederick the Great on the dullest of all earthly subjects, Germany in the 18th century, when he has piled up all the complicated material of the history of the French Revolution, lost it, and by a portent of heroism piled it all up again, when he has achieved such masterpieces of research as the discovery of sense in Cromwell's speeches and good qualities in Frederick of Prussia, when an author has done all this, it may seem a singular comment upon him to say that his main characteristic was a lack of patience. But this was in reality the chief weakness, in fact the only real weakness of Carlyle as a moralist. It is very much easier to have what may be called moral patience or mental patience than to have something which may best be described as spiritual patience. Carlyle was patient with facts, dates, documents, intolerably wearisome memoirs, but he was not patient with the soul of man. He was not patient with ideas, theories, tendencies outside his own philosophy. He never understood, and therefore persistently undervalued, the real meaning of the idea of liberty, which is a faith in the growth and life of the human mind. Vague indeed in its nature, but transcending in its magnitude even our faith in our own faiths. He was something of a Tory, something of a sans-culotte, something of a Puritan, something of an imperialist, something of a socialist. But he was never, even for a single moment, a liberal. He did not believe as the liberal believes, first indeed in his own truth, which in his eyes is pure truth, but beyond that also in that mightier truth which is made up of a million lies. And this spiritual impatience of Carlyle has left its peculiar mark in the only defect which can really be found in his historical works. Of the astonishing power and humor and poignancy of those historical works, I think it scarcely necessary to speak. A man must have a very poor literary sense who can read one of Carlyle's lighter sketches, such as The Diamond Necklace, and not feel that he has at the same time to deal with one of the greatest satirists, one of the greatest mystics, and incomparably one of the finest storytellers in the world. No historian ever realized so strongly the recondite and ill-digested fact that history has consisted of human beings, each isolated, each vacillating, each living in an eternal present. Or, in other words, that history has not consisted of crowds, or kings, or acts of parliament, or systems of government, or articles of belief. And Carlyle has, moreover, introduced into the philosophy of history one element which had been absent from it since the writing of the Old Testament, the element of something which can only be called humor in the just government of the universe. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh them to scorn. The Lord shall have them in derision, is a note that is struck again in Carlyle for the first time after 2,000 years. It is the note of the sarcasm of Providence. Anyone who will read those admirable chapters of Carlyle on Chartism will realize that while all other humanitarians were insisting upon the cruelty or the inconsistency or the barbarism of neglecting the problem of labor, Carlyle is rather filled with a kind of almost celestial astonishment at the absurdity of neglecting it. But a definite defect there is, as I have suggested, in Carlyle considered as an historian, and it flows directly from that real moral defect in his nature, an impatience with other men's ideas. In judging of men as men, he was not only quick and graphic and correct, but in the main essentially genial and magnanimous. Only a very superficial critic will think that Carlyle was misanthropic because he was surly. There is very much more real sympathy with human problems and temptations in a page of this shaggy old malcontent than in whole libraries of constitutional history by dapper and polite rationalists, who treat men as automata and put their virtues and vices into separate pigeonholes. If I had made a mistake or committed a sin that had any sort of human character about it, I would very much rather fall into the hands of Carlyle than into the hands of Mr. Hallam or Mr. James Mill. But while Carlyle did realize the fact that every man carries about with him his own life and atmosphere, he did not realize that other truth, that every man carries about with him his own theory of the world. Each one of us is living in a separate cosmos. The theory of life held by one man never corresponds exactly to that held by another. The whole of a man's opinions, morals, tastes, manners, hobbies, work back eventually to some picture of existence itself, which, whether it be a paradise or a battlefield or a school or a chaos, is not precisely the same picture of existence which lies at the back of any other brain. Carlyle had not fully realized that it was a case of one man, one cosmos. Consequently, he devoted himself to asking what place any man, say Robespierre or Shelley, occupied in Carlyle's cosmos. It never occurred to him sufficiently clearly to ask what place Shelley occupied in Shelley's cosmos, or Robespierre in Robespierre's cosmos. Not feeling the need of this, he never studied, he never really listened to Shelley's philosophy or Robespierre's philosophy. Here, after a somewhat long circuit, we have arrived at the one serious deficiency in Carlyle's histories, a neglect to realize the importance of theory and of alternative theories in human affairs. The standing example of this is the history of the French Revolution. Carlyle's conception of the French Revolution is simply and absolutely that of an elemental outbreak, an explosion of nature in history, an earthquake in the moral world. Human nature, Carlyle seems to tell us, had been stifled more and more in the wrappings of artificiality, until, when its condition had just passed the tolerable, gagged, blinded, deaf, and ignorant of what it really wanted, by a gigantic muscular effort, it burst its bonds. So far as it goes, that is perfectly true of the French Revolution, but only so far as it goes. The French Revolution was a sudden starting from slumber of that terrible spirit of man which sleeps through the greater number of the centuries, and Carlyle appreciates this and describes it more powerfully and fearfully than any human historian, because this idea of the spirit of man breaking through formulae and building again on fundamentals was a part of his own philosophical theory, and therefore he understood it. But he never, as I have said, took any real trouble to understand other people's philosophical theories. And he did not realize the other fact about the French Revolution, the fact that it was not merely an elementary outbreak, but was also a great doctrinal movement. It is an astonishing thing that Carlyle's French Revolution contrives to be as admirable and as accurate a history as it is, while from one end to the other there is hardly a suggestion that he comprehended the moral and political theories which were the guiding stars of the French revolutionists. It was not necessary that he should agree with them, but it was necessary that he should be interested in them. Nay, in order that he should write a perfect history of their developments, it was necessary that he should admire them. The truly impartial historian is not he who is enthusiastic for neither side in a historic struggle. That method was adopted by the rationalistic historians of the Hallam type, and resulted in the dullest and thinnest and most essentially false chronicles that were ever compiled about mankind. The truly impartial historian is he who is enthusiastic for both sides. He holds in his heart 100 fanaticisms. The truly philosophical historian does not patronize Cromwell and pat the king on the head as Hallam does. The true philosophical historian could ride after Cromwell like an Ironside and adore the king like a cavalier. The only history that is worth knowing, or worth striving to know, is the history of the human head and the human heart, and of what great loves it has been enamored. Truth, in the sense of the absolute justice, is a thing for which fools look in history, and wise men in the day of judgment. It is the glory of Carlyle that he did realize that the intellectual impartiality of the rationalist historian was merely emotional ignorance. It was his only defect that he extended his sympathy, in cases like that of the French Revolution, only to headlong men and impetuous actions, and not to great schools of revolutionary doctrine and faith. He made somewhat the same mistake with regard to the Middle Ages, touching which his contributions are unequaled in picturesqueness and potency. He conceived the medieval period in Europe as a barbaric verity, a rude, stalwart age. He did not realize what is more and more unfolding itself to all serious historians, that the medieval period in Europe was a civilization based upon a certain scheme of moral science of almost unexampled multiplicity and stringency, a scheme in which the colors of a lackey's coat could be traced back to a system of astronomy, and the smallest by-law for a village green had some relation to great ecclesiastical and moral mysteries. It is remarkable that we always call a rival civilization savage. The Chinese call us barbarians, and we call them barbarians. The Middle Ages were a rival civilization, based upon moral science, to ours based upon physical science. Most modern historians have abused this great civilization for being barbarous. Carlyle had made one great stride beyond them, insofar that he admired it for being barbarous. But his fatal strain of intellectual impatience prevented him from getting on to the right side of Catholic dogmas, just as it prevented him from getting on to the right side of Jacobin dogmas. He never really discovered what other people meant by apostolic succession, or liberty, or equality, or fraternity. Probably his few mistakes arose from his unfortunate tendency to find shams. Some have supposed this to be the essence and value of his message. It was in truth its worst pitfall and disaster. A man is almost always wrong when he sets about to prove the unreality and uselessness of anything. He is almost invariably right when he sets about to prove the reality and the value of anything. I have a quite different and much more genuine right to say that bullseyes are nice than I have to say licorice is nasty. I have found out the meaning of the first and not of the second. And if a man goes on a tearing hunt after shams, as Carlyle did, it is probable that he will find little or nothing real. He is tearing off the branches to find the tree. I have said all that is to be said against Carlyle's work almost designedly, for he is one of those who are so great that we rather need to blame them for the sake of our own independence than praise them for the sake of their fame. He came and spoke a word, and the chatter of rationalism stopped, and the sums would no longer work out and be ended. He was a breath of nature, turning in her sleep under the load of civilization, a stir in the very stillness of God to tell us he was still there. Biographical note. In a house which his father, a mason, had built with his own hands, Thomas Carlyle was born on December 4, 1795. His mother, Margaret Aitken, a woman of the fairest descent, that of the pious, the just, and wise, was the second wife of James Carlyle, and Thomas was the eldest of their 9 children. In the Entefel of Sartor Resartus, Carlyle has pictured his native village. It consisted of a single street, down the side of which ran an open brook. "With amazement," he writes, "I began to discover that Entefel stood in the middle of a country, of a world. It was then that, independently of Schiller's Wilhelm Tell, I made this not quite insignificant reflection, so true also in spiritual things: any road this simple Entefel road will lead you to the end of the world." The room at Arch House in which she was born now contains some interesting mementos. On the mantelpiece are 2 turned wooden candlesticks, a gift of John Stirling, sent from Rome. The table provides a resting place for his study lamp and his tea caddy. Most of the furniture came from Cheney Row. Carlyle came from Ecclefechan to attend Edinburgh University when he was scarcely 14 years of age, and with a companion, Tom Schmale, journeyed the entire distance on foot. They secured a clean-looking and cheap lodging in Simon Square, a poor neighborhood on the south side of Edinburgh, off Nicholson Street. After residing in various parts of the old town, Carlyle removed in 1821 to better quarters, and the most interesting of his various abodes in Edinburgh was at 1 Maury Street, now Spey Street, Leith Walk. Here he commenced his literary work in earnest, and began to regard life from a brighter standpoint. Leith Walk is described in Sartor Resartus as the Rue Saint Thomas de l'Enfer. "All at once," he writes, "there rose a thought in me, and I asked myself, 'What art thou afraid of?' It is from this hour that I incline to date my spiritual new birth, or baphometric fire baptism. Perhaps I directly thereupon began to be a man." It was at Kirkaley that Carlyle first met Edward Irving, the master of a rival school in the town. They became intimate friends. "But for Irving," he says, "I had never known what the communion of man with man means." It was here, too, that he made the acquaintance of Miss Margaret Gordon, the Bloomine of Sartor Resartus. Carlyle describes the town in the Reminiscences. Kirkaley itself was a solidly diligent, yet by no means a panting, puffing, or in any way gambling Lang Tun. I, in particular, always rather liked the people, though from the distance chiefly, chagrined and discouraged by the sad trade one had. In 1815 the Carlyles moved to Main Farm, and here he first learned German, studied Faust in a dry ditch, and completed his translation of Wilhelm Meister. 10 years later Carlyle took possession of Hotham Hill Farm, his mother going with him as housekeeper, and his brother Alec as practical farmer. Here they remained until 1826. "With all its manifold petty troubles," says Carlyle in the Reminiscences, "this year at Hotham Hill has a rustic beauty and dignity to me, and lies now like a not ignoble russet-coated idol in my memory." The abrupt termination of Carlyle's tenancy of Hotham Hill occurred simultaneously with the expiration of his father's lease of Mainhill, and in 1826 the family removed to Scottsbrigg, that excellent shell of a house, for farming purposes, where Carlyle's parents spent the remainder of their lives. In this unpretentious home Carlyle passed many restful holidays among his own people. In the ancient county town of Haddington, he writes, on July 14, 1801, there was born to a lately wedded pair a little daughter, whom they named Jane Bailey Welsh, and whose subsequent and final name, her own common signature for many years, was Jane Welsh Carlyle. Oh, she was noble, very noble, in that early as in all other periods, and made the ugliest and dullest into something beautiful. I look back on it as if through rainbows, the bit of sunshine hers, the tears my own. Mrs. Carlyle, in her early letters, mentions her father's home at Haddington, where she was born. It is my native place still, and after all there is much in it that I love. I love the bleaching green, where I used to caper and roll and tumble, and make Owain necklaces and chains of dandelion stalks in the days of my wee existence. Carlyle's marriage with Jane Bailey Welsh took place on October 17, 1826, at Templand, where Mrs. Welsh then resided. The ceremony was of the quietest description, his brother, John Carlyle, being the only person present besides Miss Welsh's family. For 18 months after their marriage, the Carlyles lived at 21 Comley Bank, the trim little cottage, far from all the uproar and putrescence, material and spiritual, of the reeky town, the sound of which we hear not, and only see over the knowe the reflection of its gaslights against the dusky sky. It was during this time that Carlyle contributed essays to the Edinburgh and foreign quarterly reviews. In 1828 a removal was made to Mr. Welsh's manor at Craigenputtoch, where, in the solitude almost druidical, Sartor Resartus was written. "Poor Puttoch," he exclaims in one of his letters, "castle of many chagrins, peat bog castle, where the devil never slumbers nor sleeps, very touching art thou to me when I look on thy image here." In this lonely spot, cut off from all social intercourse, the Carlyles remained until 1834, when, after 6 years' imprisonment on the Dumfriesshire moor, they moved to Chelsea and took up their residence at No. 5 Cheney Row, in the house which was to be their home until death. After a week's wearisome house hunting in London under the guidance of Leigh Hunt, Carlyle sent a long description of the proposed new residence to his wife, of which the following is an extract. "We are called Cheney Row, properly pronounced Cheney Row, and are a genteel neighborhood, 2 old ladies on the one side, unknown character on the other, but with pianos, as Hunt said. The street is flag-pathed, sunk-storied, iron-railed, all old-fashioned and tightly done up. The house itself is eminent, antique, wainscoted to the very ceiling, and has been all new painted and repaired. On the whole, a most massive, roomy, sufficient old house, with places, for example, to hang, say, 3 dozen hats or cloaks on, and as many crevices and queer old presses and shelved closets as would gratify the most covetous goody. Rent £35. I confess I am strongly tempted." The brightest and happiest part of Carlyle's day was the early evening. Home between 5 and 6, with mud mackintoshes off, and the nightmares locked up for a while. I tried for an hour's sleep before my solitary, dietetic, altogether simple bit of dinner, but first always came up for half an hour to the drawing-room and her, where a bright, kindly fire was sure to be burning, candles hardly lit, all in trustful chiaroscuro. This was the one bright portion of my black day. Oh, those evening half-hours! How beautiful and blessed they were! The garden at Cheney Row was much appreciated by the Carlyles, who turned to the best advantage this poor, sooty patch. Mrs. Carlyle writes, "Behind we have a garden, so called in the language of flattery, in the worst of order, but boasting of 2 vines which produced 2 bunches of grapes in the season, which might be eaten, and a walnut tree, from which I gathered almost 6d. worth of walnuts." Here stood the quaint china barrels she often referred to as noblemen's seats, but Carlyle generally used one of the kitchen chairs by preference. He found the garden of admirable comfort in the smoking way, and sometimes in summer would have his writing table placed under an awning stretched for that purpose, and with a tray full of books at his side, would work there when the heat drove him from his garret study. The construction of this soundproof study was proposed as far back as 1843, but not until 10 years later was the enterprise put into practical execution. On August 11, 1853, Carlyle wrote to his sister, "At length, after deep deliberation, I have fairly decided to have a top story put upon the house, one big apartment 20 feet square, with thin double walls, light from the top, etc., and artfully ventilated, into which no sound can come, and all the cocks in nature may crow around it without my hearing a whisper of them." The scheme looked promising on paper, but the result was irremediably somewhat of a failure. Although the noises in the immediate neighborhood were excluded, sounds in the distance, evils that he knew not of in the lower rooms, became painfully audible. Nevertheless, he occupied the room as his study until 1865, and here, whirled aloft by angry elements, he completed what Dr. Garnett named well his 13 years' war with Frederick. His writing table and armchair stood near the center, and within easy reach was the little mahogany table for the books he happened to be using, or such of them as were not on the floor. Carlyle bequeathed his writing table to Sir James Stephen. "I know," he wrote in his will, "he will accept it as a distinguished mark of my esteem. He knows that it belonged to my father-in-law and his daughter, and that I have written all my books upon it, except only Schiller, and that for 50 years and upwards that are now past I have considered it among the most precious of my possessions." It was into the ground-floor room, at that time spoken of as the parlor, that Edward Irving was ushered when he paid his one visit to Cheyne Row in autumn 1834. "I recollect," writes Carlyle in the Reminiscences, "how he complimented her, as well he might, on the pretty little room she had made for her husband and self, and running his eye over her dainty bits of arrangement, ornamentations, all so frugal, simple, full of grace, propriety, and ingenuity, as they ever were, said, smiling, 'You are like an Eve, and make a little paradise wherever you are.'" No description of Carlyle's Chelsea home would be complete without mention of the kitchen, where Mrs. Carlyle made marmalade pure as liquid amber, in taste and look almost poetically delicate, and where, too, she stirred Leigh Hunt's endlessly admirable morsels of Scotch porridge. Readers of the Letters and Memorials will obtain many glimpses of this apartment and its occupants. The fittings were very old-fashioned, especially the open kitchen range, with its kettle crane and movable niggards. The dresser, which stood there in 1834, remains against the south wall. The table still stands in the center, and there is a sink in the corner beside the disconnected pump. When Carlyle was resting at Dumfries after the exhaustion of his triumphant inaugural address upon his installation as Lord Rector of Edinburgh University, he received the announcement of his wife's sudden death whilst driving in her carriage in Hyde Park on April 21, 1866. The effect of the calamity upon him was terrible. "There is no spirit in me to write," he said, "though I try it sometimes." Mrs. Carlyle was buried in Haddington Church. "I laid her in the grave of her father," writes Carlyle in the Reminiscences, "according to covenant of 40 years back, and all was ended. In the nave of old Abbey Kirk, long a ruin, now being saved from further decay, with the skies looking down on her, there sleeps my little Jeannie, and the light of her face will never shine on me more." The inscription on Carlyle's tombstone is very simple. The family crest, 2 wyverns, the family motto, Humilitate, and then these few words: "Here rests Thomas Carlyle, who was born at Ecclesfechan, 4th December, 1795, and died at 24 Cheyne Row, Chelsea, London, on Saturday, 5th February, 1881. No monument," writes Froude, "is needed for one who has made an eternal memorial for himself in the hearts of all to whom truth is the dearest of possessions. End of Part II. End of Thomas Carlyle by Gilbert Keith Chesterton and John Ernest Hodder Williams.